Good morning, everybody. Jason Wheeler here in the WFAA newsroom with senior political reporter Jason Whiteley and senior crime and justice reporter Rebecca Lopez. We are doing a special report here on our digital channels. Just to let you know ahead of time, we're also going to be doing this report on our television channel at some point, so there may be a little bit of a switch over when that happens here in a few minutes. We are digesting a report that is almost 600 pages long that has come down from the Department of Justice this morning regarding the shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde 2 years ago. This is a much anticipated report. We've been pouring through it. It tells us a lot of what we already knew, but it also fills in some of the blanks that we did not know before today. We are awaiting a news conference in Uvalde from the Activity Center there, also known as the Community Center there in that town, and that is going to be headed up by Attorney General Merrick Garland. We're going to be going to that news conference as soon as it begins. Right now it is scheduled for straight up at about 11 o'clock. We don't know if there's going to be a speaker before him. We also don't know if he's going to be taking questions after that, after what he has to say there. Hopefully so, though, because even as we're pouring through this document that is, again, as I say, almost 600 pages long, you do feel like you have a lot of questions, and in some cases, new questions pop up after what you read in here. Let's just go down the line here and talk about the main takeaways from what we've been able to ingest of this so far. We've only had this report for a short time. We haven't read every word of it yet. Rebecca, what is your first takeaway when we're looking this thing over?
I think the thing that the families are probably going to be most disappointed about in this report is that there were no recommendations for any kind of criminal charges. And it also, they were hoping that it would go step by step, officer by officer, of what every officer was doing at the time and their lack of action. And that's not in this report. Now, typically in these types of after action reports, like in Allen, and also they did it after July 7th shootings here in downtown Dallas,
where the five
officers were killed, they don't typically do any kind of criminal charges or recommendations. They'll make recommendations on training and, you know, things like that, but typically there are no like criminal charges that are suggested by the Justice Department.
So for anybody there who was looking for accountability coming after this, because almost 2 years down the line now, all of those who were in charge that day of their respective agencies, as far as we know, are still there, except for Pete Arredondo, who was heading up the Uvalde Schools Police Department, who a lot of people thought was supposed to be in charge that day according to protocols, but he wasn't, and said he didn't know that he was supposed to be. So if you were looking for accountability out of this report, that is not what we're seeing in this report at this point. In fact, they say that they set out to, quote, assess what happened and, quote, provide guidance moving forward. in the unfortunate situation where we see another one of these tragedies. So basically, they're trying to build upon best practices, and sometimes the way you do that is learning the way not to do things. I think this sounds like it was that.
Yeah, Jason, I think it's important to point out here that this was a requested report by the mayor down there, Don McLaughlin.
Right.
And to zoom out on what this is, the Department of Justice did this, obviously, the federal government did this, but the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services did this. As Jason mentioned, this is not about accountability, unfortunately, because that is what the community, the victims' families, the victims down there have wanted for almost 2 years now. That did not come out in this. What is interesting, though, is they looked at 14,000 pieces of data and documentation. They looked at the CCTV video from inside the school, body cam video, documents, training manuals, all this stuff here. And they hinted around some of the issues that happened there. Pete Arredondo, the CISD police chief down there, that he retreated, and they turned this from an active shooter into a barricaded suspect situation, which changed the response, Rebecca, as you know.
Right, and since Columbine, they have trained, and in this state, there is actually a manual that they give officers on what you are supposed to do during an active shooter situation. And in this case, it says that they were also, in this particular department, was trained not only that it would be an active shooter situation if shots are being fired, but that it could transition into a barricaded person. And that is never the case if shots are still being fired. It should be an active shooter situation, and you should go in with whatever you have. If it's your sidearm, and I pulled up this priority of life that is part of the manual that they teach officers and what they really tell them that they have to follow. And it says the priority of life scale is the guide to first responders during critical decision-making process. As first responders, we must recognize the innocent life must be defended. A first responder unwilling to place the lives of innocent above their own safety should consider another career field. And that is what they
That's
continue.
how they lay it out in
They lay it out in the manual. This is how they are trained. You have to put your life at risk if you are an officer or find another line of work, because I get it, you want to come home to your family, but at the end of the day, these are children that have no protection, that are getting killed.
And yet 400 police officers, 400 law enforcement personnel were there from local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. And almost 2 years to the date, we have not seen any accountability at all. The last time I interviewed the governor, Governor Abbott, was last year, actually a year and a half ago now, before his re-election. And one of my questions to him was, what are we going to do? What are you going to do if you find that laws were broken? Will you fire Steve McCraw? He hedged off that and said, listen, we want to find out what happened first. Here we are waiting to find out what happened. What you're watching now is the setup for this news conference in Uvalde. This is at the community center that Jason was mentioning here. You see the seal on the lectern there. That is for the United States Attorney General making a rare visit down here. Merrick Garland is not a politician. He's a former judge, a Supreme Court nominee for a while before that went away, and now he's the AG. It raised flags here when they sent him from D.C. down here. First thing we're thinking about is, will he announce federal charges? That is not our understanding today.
And I hope that they ask the question at the press conference, are there any statutes that there would be any kind of criminal charges that they could file against these officers? We don't know. Right now, the DA in Uvalde is the one that is conducting any kind of criminal investigation, and we've been able to get nothing as far as any information out of that office of what is happening with the criminal.
Her name is Christina Mitchell. She, of course, is still investigating this, she says. The Department of Public Safety is still investigating this, going on 2 years now. And we talked about this in a podcast that we're about to release here in the next day or so. Jason and I did. And the suspect's dead in this situation. It's case closed. We know what happened. The Texas House of Representatives did an investigation. The DOJ report that's coming out now is based off that investigation. We're still waiting to see what the Uvalde DA comes up with. What's the delay on this? What's DPS's delay on this? You've seen a lot of investigations from law enforcement. What do you think they might be doing on the inside there?
That is a good question. And there were people that wondered whether or not this particular DA was going to be able to have, I guess, I don't know, for lack of a better word, the guts to file these criminal charges against police officers and people in their own city, and whether or not that was going to happen. So there was some politics surrounding some of this. But
it's
now,
been a very long wait.
One of the things, Jason, I don't know if you saw this as well, that is glaring is that after the shooting, there were officers that were not supposed to be there, that were not investigative officers, that went back to the crime scene basically to gawk. And it is outlined in this report. And they went back days later, and they said they compromised the integrity of this crime scene, even though we weren't sure whether or not criminal charges were going to be filed against any of them. They went back to look at the crime scene, which to me, if I was a family member, I would be appalled at the actions, not just before, during, but after these children have been killed.
Again, you have law enforcement that should have known better.
Just a moment ago, because this is something that they are trained not to do. I mean, we talk about the training of going in when you have an active shooter. That was missed. You talk about training of not violating a crime scene so that evidence can be collected and so forth. That was missed as well. That is a new piece of information, though. Again, a lot of this report here in Texas, we've had the House hearings and so forth. A lot of information has trickled out in bits and pieces. And thanks to the media, we have seen quite a bit of stuff come to light, again, in bits and pieces. This is a new piece of information that we didn't have before about the contamination of that crime scene.
Yeah, and that is problematic, because if they do bring charges against any officers, we know that the integrity and evidence has to be preserved properly. And they said they had to keep stopping their investigation and restarting so they could get people out of the crime scene. And I don't understand the leadership there, and that includes whoever was out there at this point, whether it was DPS, that did not protect that crime scene. They should have. In downtown Dallas, after the July 7th, when the officers were shot, you couldn't get anywhere near that crime scene. It was roped off. I don't even understand how these officers were able to go back into that school and into those classrooms afterwards. It's really appalling.
We've talked about whether there will be accountability, even though this report specifically is not about assigning accountability or coming out with charges per se. You do wonder, and hopefully they will take questions after this news conference, after their statement that they put out here in just a bit, because that is one of the key questions in my mind anyway. Could this be used as a springboard toward accountability later on, even if it's not included in this particular report? The other thing I would be very curious to ask, if I'm sitting in that room with them there, how much assistance, how much help did you get? How much cooperation did you get from state officials? Because again, this is something that could have affected any of us, could have affected any of our kids. You want the information to come out. You want the best knowledge, going forward as to what went wrong and how do we prevent that from happening again. They said they interviewed more than 260 people from more than 30 different organizations, including state law enforcement that was there on scene. My question is, yes, you interviewed them. Yes, you got some information from them. Did you get everything that you were asking for, or was anything withheld? Because, a lot of people keep smelling a cover-up, a big cover-up here.
Absolutely, and it's just a reminder to people that one of the things that also came out in this report is the fact that you had all of these officers standing outside the classrooms, not going in. And part of the training, again, in that active shooter training is they were waiting for ballistic shields and the SWAT team. You don't have to do that in an active shooter situation. You were trained to go in with what you have on your body, and that is, if it's just your sidearm, your bulletproof vest. Because remember, these are children that don't have any of that. And I think one of the teachers, I remember seeing an interview talking about that. Like, we were just sitting there waiting. These are people that had the ballistic shields came within minutes.
That's another piece of new information.
And so it's just really heart-wrenching to read this because of the inaction of these officers, and reiterated again in this report.
Yeah, that's another new piece of information that we got, and I just want to read you this paragraph. I don't think we knew this coming into today. It's talking about stimulus events. That's what the DOJ is calling this. They say, from the time that law enforcement entered Robb Elementary, there were several stimuli that should have prompted leadership to direct a team to enter the classrooms and engage the suspect. For the span of more than an hour, there were at least 10 stimulus events, 10 stimulus events, including at least 6 separate instances of gunfire, totaling approximately 45 rounds in law enforcement officer presence, as well as officer injuries and the presence of victims. any one of these events should have driven the law enforcement response to take steps to immediately stop the killing per the active shooter protocols that you were just talking about.
And the children calling 911 saying he's shooting. You could hear what's going on. I mean, it really is just so frustrating to read this report, and I can only imagine how the families are reacting to this today.
I'm curious to see too, Jason, what, if any, reaction we get from the governor. I know we're reaching out to him, to the DPS as well. I'm curious, will we see reaction today from this?
I keep refreshing this. I'm sure we'll see something from the governor's office, from DPS as well. We're going on the air with our newscast right now, so we're going to wrap things up here for a moment and go to our newscast.
Released 2 hours ago of a Justice Department report on the deadly Uvalde school shooting. The report blasting law enforcement, finding cascading failures that could and should have stopped the massacre sooner. 19 students, all fourth graders and 2 teachers, died in their classrooms that day in May 2022. Thanks for joining us this midday. I'm Tashara Parker. That report expected this afternoon, but released early. I want to give you a live look from Uvalde right now, where we are expecting Attorney General Merrick Garland to discuss the findings in that report this hour. We'll, of course, bring that to you when it happens. As we wait, I want to bring in our Jason Wheeler, Jason Whiteley, and Rebecca Lopez, who have been going through the report and its findings. Guys?
Thanks, Tashara. Yes, this morning we have been having digital coverage on this, and we want to thank everybody who's been watching on that channel for continuing with us here. For all of those of you here who are joining us over the air, basically we have set up in a panel here. We've got people out in the field as well, because we're trying to digest this entire report coming in from the Department of Justice this morning. It is voluminous, almost 600 pages that we are going through. As we've been talking about, as we've been streaming here for the past little while here this morning, a lot of this report we knew. We knew at least the broad contours of what it's going into. There are instances in here, though, where we are seeing new information, things that we didn't know before today about what happened in Robb Elementary almost 2 years ago. We are, as Tashara said, awaiting a news conference there in Uvalde at the Activity Center. That is expected to start any moment now. We're going to bring that to you live in its entirety when it begins. We are expecting to hear directly from the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, about this report that his department has put out. Again, this report was made at the request of the mayor in Uvalde, but Rebecca, for anybody who was looking for accountability coming into this day with this report coming out, they are not likely to see that. This is really just sort of an after-action report on lessons learned.
And I think that that is one of the things that the families really wanted. They wanted a step-by-step what every officer was doing, what they did or did not do, and they wanted names. They wanted the officers named. Why did you not breach the door? Why did you stand out there? What were you doing? What was your responsibility? And none of that is in this report. And in fact, they don't really even name any of the commanders that were out there at the scene, except for Pete Arredondo, who was the de facto commander, as they said in this report. And I think that that is something that the families are really still wanting, is some accountability, criminal charges. None of that is addressed in this report.
Jason, we were just getting into this in our streaming coverage before we came on to broadcast here. So just to sort of recap what we were talking about, though, when we talk about accountability, we're curious, are we going to hear today from the governor? Are we going to hear from DPS about this? This is a damning report about what happened that day, just like every report that's come out has been damning.
This is the second one built off the Texas House of Representatives' own investigation, which came out last year. The DOJ started its report. And as Rebecca mentioned here, this is an after-action report. So it's not pointing fingers, which is what victims' families, the community, and so many people across the state and around the country are really wanting right now. The Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services did this. They looked at 14,000 records from multiple law enforcement agencies to try to get down to exactly what happened from the federal government standpoint. The feds got involved in this because they wanted to have a separate, independent report as opposed to having DPS investigate itself, since it had most of the troopers there that day. You have the Uvalde County District Attorney, Christina Mitchell, who is still currently investigating this, almost 2 years now since this happened. But at this hour, we are still waiting for the U.S. Attorney General, Merrick Garland, to come before that lectern in Uvalde and explain what his office found. And as we mentioned in the streaming coverage a moment ago, we'll pick up a little later in the hour here too, it is very rare for a U.S. Attorney General, this U.S. Attorney General, to get out of D.C., to go to a place like this when he's not announcing charges.
Yeah, when we first heard that he was coming personally, our first inclination was to think, oh, are charges going to be announced here?
Yeah.
And apparently we're not going to see that today.
Well, and I think that we also learned a lot of the stuff that we already know. I mean, it basically
Here we go.
Here he goes. Here is the Attorney General.
I came here to tell them that the United States Department of Justice has finished its critical incident review. In undertaking this review at the request of the then mayor, the Justice Department committed to using our expertise and independence to assess the law enforcement response to the shooting and provide guidance moving forward. As I told families and survivors last night, the department's review concluded that a series of major failures in leadership, in tactics, in communications, in training, and in preparedness were made by law enforcement leaders and others responding to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary. As a result, 33 students and 3 of their teachers, many of whom had been shot, were trapped in a room with an active shooter for over an hour as law enforcement officials remained outside. I also told the families and survivors how deeply sorry I am for the losses they suffered that day and for the losses they have suffered every day since. I told them that the priority for the Justice Department in preparing this report has been to honor the memories of those who were taken from them. And I told the families gathered last night what I hope is clear among the hundreds of pages and thousands of details in this report. Their loved ones deserve better. The law enforcement response at Robb Elementary School on May 24, 2022, and in the hours and days after, was a failure that should not have happened. We hope to honor the victims and the survivors by working together to try to prevent anything like this from ever happening again, here or anywhere. I'm now going to turn to the key observations and recommendations of the report. On May 24, 2022 at 11:33 a.m., an active shooter wearing body armor and equipped with a high-power AR-15 rifle entered Robb Elementary School and began shooting into classrooms 111 and 112, which shared a connecting door. Within minutes, 11 law enforcement officers from the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District and the Uvalde Police Department arrived inside the school. Hearing continued gunfire, 5 officers immediately advanced toward classrooms 111 and 112. Within seconds, shots were fired from inside the classroom. Shrapnel hit 2 officers, and all responders retreated to cover. A single officer then made additional attempts to approach the classrooms, but after 11:40 a.m., no more attempts to enter the rooms were made until 12:48 p.m., more than an hour later. As a consequence of failed leadership, training, and policies, injured and scared students and teachers remained trapped with the subject in the classrooms, waiting to be rescued. Survivors later shared that they heard officers gathered outside the classrooms while they waited. The victims trapped in classroom 111 and 112 were waiting to be rescued at 11:44 a.m., approximately 10 minutes after officers first arrived, when the subject fired another shot inside the classrooms. They were still waiting at 11:56 a.m. when an officer on the scene told law enforcement leaders that his wife, a teacher, was inside room 111 and 112 and had been shot. They were still waiting as broadcasts went out on officer radios that a student trapped inside rooms 111 and had called 911 at 12:10 p.m. to say that that the student was in a room full of victims. That student stayed on the phone with 911 for 16 minutes. The victims were still waiting to be rescued when the subject fired 4 more shots inside the classrooms at 12:21 p.m., 49 minutes after officers arrived on the scene. And they were still waiting for another 27 minutes after that until finally officers entered the classroom and killed the subject. As the victims were trapped and waiting for help, many of their families were waiting outside the school, growing increasingly concerned about why law enforcement had not taken action to rescue their loved ones. Law enforcement officers from different agencies who had self-deployed to the scene in overwhelming numbers were themselves waiting for leadership decisions about how to proceed. Many officers reported that they did not know who, if anyone, was in charge, what they should do, or the status of the incident. Some officers were confused about why there was no attempt to confront the active shooter and rescue the children. Some officers believed the subject had already been killed, or that law enforcement was in the room with the shooter. 75 minutes after the first officers arrived on scene, officers finally entered room 111. The subject engaged the entry team with gunfire, and the officers responded with fire. 77 minutes after the first officers arrived on the scene, and after 45 rounds had been fired by the active shooter, the shooter was killed. The massacre at Robb Elementary shattered families throughout this community and devastated our country. 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. And untold numbers of students, teachers, and law enforcement officers were injured. The law enforcement response to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary was a failure. As the threat posed to our country by mass shootings has grown and evolved over the past several decades, law enforcement's response tactics have also changed. The massacre at Columbine High School 25 years ago, and the 47 minutes it took for law enforcement to enter that high school, marked a major shift in how law enforcement leaders think about responding to mass shootings. It is now widely understood by law enforcement agencies across the country that in active shooter incidents, time is not on the side of law enforcement. Every second counts. And the priority of law enforcement must be to immediately enter the room and stop the shooter with whatever weapons and tools officers have with them. That is the approach responding officers first employed when they arrived at Robb Elementary School. But within minutes of arriving inside the school, officials on scene transitioned from treating the scene as an active shooter situation to treating the shooter as a barricaded subject. This was the most significant failure. That failure meant that law enforcement officials prioritized a protracted evacuation of students and teachers in other classrooms instead of immediately rescuing the victims trapped with the active shooter. It meant that officials spent time trying to negotiate with the subject instead of entering the room and confronting him. It meant that officials asked for and waited for additional responders and equipment instead of following generally accepted active shooter practice and moving toward the shooter with the resources they had. It meant waiting for a set of keys to open the classroom door, which the report concludes was likely unlocked anyway. And it meant that the victims remained trapped with the shooter for more than an hour after the first officers arrived on scene. There were also other failures in leadership, command, and coordination. None of the law enforcement leaders at the scene established an incident command structure to provide timely direction, control, and coordination among the enormous number of responders who arrived on scene. This lack of a command structure, exacerbated by communication difficulties, contributed to confusion among responders about who was in charge and how they could help. These failures may also have been influenced by policy and training deficiencies at responding law enforcement agencies. Some lacked any active shooter training at all. Some had inappropriate training. Some lacked critical incident response training. And the vast majority had never trained together with different agencies. As Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta will discuss in further detail, the chaos and confusion that defined the law enforcement response while the shooter remained a threat also defined the aftermath of the shooting. For example, surviving victims, some with bullet wounds and other injuries, were put on buses without being brought to the attention of medics. Some families were told that their family members had survived when they had not. And victims, families, and community members struggled to receive timely and accurate information about what had occurred at Robb Elementary. The Justice Department's objective in preparing this report was threefold. First, to honor the victims, the survivors, and their loved ones. Second, to provide a clear and independent accounting of the law enforcement response to the horrific attack that devastated this community. And third, to provide law enforcement agencies and communities across the country with analysis and recommendations about how what happened at Uvalde should inform efforts to prepare themselves for and respond to mass shootings. Policing is a noble profession. It is also a hard one. It requires training and constant education about evolving threats. The report includes widely accepted recommendations that have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country about how to prepare for and respond to active shooter situations. Before an active shooter incident occurs, law enforcement agencies have a responsibility to ensure that their leaders and all their officers are trained to focus on rapid response, trained that the first officers on the scene must focus on eliminating the threat and protecting the victims most in danger. Law enforcement officers responding to an active shooter must be prepared to take charge, to establish a unified command, and to facilitate communications, operational coordination, and allocation and delivery of resources. They must continually assess and adjust as the incident evolves. And in the aftermath of a mass shooting, law enforcement and government agencies must provide the public with a sense of trust and confidence by communicating openly, clearly, and compassionately during a time in which many are learning the most devastating news that any human being can receive. The victims and survivors of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary on May 24th, 2022 deserve better. First and foremost, the 19 children and their 2 teachers who were stolen from their loved ones should be here today. They should have been targeted by a mass shooter. We must never forget the shooter's heinous act that day. And the victims and survivors should never have been trapped with that shooter for more than an hour as they waited for their rescue. The families of the victims and survivors deserve more than incomplete, inaccurate, and conflicting communications about the status of their loved ones. This community deserves more than misinformation from officials during and after the attack. Responding officers here in Uvalde, who also lost loved ones and who still bear the emotional scars of that day, deserve the kind of leadership and training that would have prepared them to do the work that was required. Our children deserve better than to grow up in a country where an 18-year-old has easy access to a weapon that belongs on the battlefield not in a classroom. And communities across the country and the law enforcement officers who protect them deserve better than to be forced to respond to one horrific mass shooting after another. But that is the terrible reality that we face. And so it is a reality that every law enforcement agency in every community across the country must be prepared for. No community and no law enforcement agency should have to face that threat alone. That is why we came to Uvalde, and that is why we are releasing this report. The Justice Department remains committed to working in partnership with communities across the country and with the law enforcement agencies working to protect those communities every day. In particular, we stand ready to help communities and agencies prepared to respond to a terrible incident like the one that occurred here. We have concluded the department's review, but we know that the work of healing here in Uvalde is only beginning. We are humbled and grateful to stand with this community as you remember and honor your loved ones. I will now turn the podium over to Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Her leadership has been key to the department's efforts to conduct an independent, fair, and comprehensive review of the horrific mass shooting of May 24th and its aftermath. I am also grateful to the entire Critical Incident Review team and to the department's COPS office and to the leadership of Hugh Clements for their tireless work. Vanita.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. It is hard to look at the truth that the law enforcement response on May 24th was an unimaginable failure and that a lack of action by adults failed to protect children and their teachers. But we cannot look away from what happened here. We cannot look away from these children, and we cannot look away from what happened in Uvalde. On May 24th, 2022, this community lost 19 beloved children and 2 cherished teachers at Robb Elementary School. In the days and weeks following, this community also lost a sense of faith and trust in their own neighbors and institutions as they tried to make sense of what happened on the 24th and were unable to get the answers they needed. During that time, the then mayor of Uvalde called me to ask the Justice Department to conduct an independent review of what had happened and what went wrong on May 24th and in the days that followed. Shortly after, the Justice Department began its review. The Attorney General just gave a sense of the detailed timeline that we have laid out and the cascading failures that occurred over the course of 77 minutes between when law enforcement arrived on the scene and when they finally entered the classroom. But we also know the pain and the failures and missteps did not end when law enforcement finally entered the classrooms and rescued the survivors. It continued at minute 78, when it became clear that because there was no leader, there was no plan to triage the 35 victims in classrooms 111 and 112, many of whom had been shot. Victims were moved away without precautions. Without appropriate precautions, victims who had already passed away were taken to the hospital in ambulances, while children with bullet wounds were put on school buses without any medical attention. In the commotion, one adult victim was placed on a walkway, on the ground, outside to be attended to. She died there. The reunification and notification process for families was similarly chaotic, and as some of the families described, truly deeply painful. During and after the 77 minutes, families and survivors received unclear and sometimes conflicting information about where to go to reunite with their loved ones. Many family members waited at the school for hours without status updates, not knowing where their children were, if they were safe or hurt or even alive. Families searching desperately for their loved ones were sent to different places all across town: the high school, the civic center, the hospital. Some of these details are gut-wrenching. Families hearing about the need for autopsy results as the first indications that their loved ones may not have survived. At one point, hours after the shooting, an official incorrectly told families waiting for their children at the Civic Center that an additional bus of survivors was coming. It did not. Inaccurate and inconsistent public communications, including social media posts and press conferences, only made things worse. At 12:06 p.m., law enforcement posted on Facebook, reassuring parents that, quote, students and staff are safe in the buildings, close quote. That false reassurance was never corrected. An hour later, law enforcement inaccurately posted on social media that the shooter was in custody. That post, too, was never corrected. Both impromptu and scheduled news conferences and media engagements contained inaccurate, incomplete, and at times conflicting information. Mirroring the failures of the law enforcement response, state and local agencies failed to coordinate, leading to inaccurate and incomplete information being provided to anxious family and community members and the public. We also know the pain following a tragedy like this endures, and that the support this community needs has often been missing. And we cannot talk about what happened at Robb Elementary School without reckoning with the fact that this tragedy took place somewhere all children should feel supported and cared for and safe. Our report documents missteps in school safety preparation that contributed to this tragedy, including that the campus safety plan was effectively a template and included security measures that were not even available at Robb. That there was a culture of complacency around locked door policies with interior and exterior doors routinely left unlocked. And that confusion over where to find a master key to unlock classroom doors contributed to the significant delay in entering classrooms 111 and 112. As I made clear last April when I came to Uvalde to meet with families, and as we reiterated to families last night, this report not only looked backwards, but also identifies lessons learned and recommendations for other communities to prevent something like this from happening again. No law enforcement agency or community can assume that what happened here, or in Newtown, or in Parkland, or in Columbine can't happen in their community. That is our reality. This report offers 273 recommendations for law enforcement agencies and other officials in every community. That includes a series of recommendations for law enforcement and government agencies preparing for and responding to mass shooting incidents and active shooter incidents as they occur. In the immediate aftermath of an active shooter incident, law enforcement leaders must continue to provide guidance and direction to all first responders, including triage planning to ensure that emergency personnel can access victims as soon as possible. Law enforcement and government officials must provide proactive, timely, and accurate information, notifications, and give community members as much information as appropriate at any given time to help avoid or mitigate rumors, uncertainty, and unnecessary worry. If an organization shares incorrect information with the public, it should be open about it and correct that mistake. In the days, weeks, and years after a devastating attack, survivors, the family members of victims, community members, law enforcement, and other first responders, and their families should continue to be offered both immediate and ongoing trauma support. The Justice Department remains committed to the Uvalde community. Federal Victims of Crime Act formula funds are being used to support victim services in Uvalde, and our Office for Victims of Crime is working with the state of Texas and the Uvalde community to complete the application for supplemental Justice Department funding that is going to enable continuing services for victims, survivors, and their families. And through our COPS office, the department has also awarded the local school district substantial funding over the past 2 years through our school violence prevention program to help this community continue to improve school safety and security. Before we started this review, we consulted with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to build out a team of experts, including several law enforcement leaders who have ably led their communities through mass violence events. I am grateful to those leaders who lent their expertise to us and to our COPS office team for their immense dedication and commitment. Together, the review team's work included reviewing more than 14,000 pieces of data and documentation, including policies and procedures, training logs, body camera and closed-circuit television footage, photographs, and more. They made 9 visits to Uvalde for a total of 54 days in this community. They conducted more than 260 interviews of individuals from more than 30 organizations and agencies, including responding law enforcement and survivors, family members, victim services providers, and school and hospital staff. They traveled throughout the country to review generally accepted practices and contemporary active shooter training courses. Other organizations and news outlets have documented parts of what happened on this horrific day. But all of this work has led to a Justice Department report that is both the most detailed and broadest in scope, looking beyond the immediate incident to include the communications, victim services, and school safety aspects of this tragedy, as well as the post-incident response and investigation and pre-incident planning and preparation. The public demands a lot from law enforcement, and we often take their service for granted. Every day, police officers run towards danger to keep people safe. In Uvalde on May 24th, 2022, that did not happen until far too late. Uvalde is a community that is healing, and getting clear on the facts is part of healing. So too are the beautiful, powerful murals all over the city, commemorating each child and teacher killed on May 24th. And so too is enacting change in policies and practices to help make sure these failures do not happen again. While it took time for the Justice Department to examine the facts and put this report together, our commitment to the Uvalde community does not end here. Through available funding, resources, victim services, technical assistance, and training, we will support Uvalde and communities across the country in their efforts to prevent and address violence. Just as we have looked back, we will look forward. We are committed to honoring the memories of the lives that were lost here by working to build a future where all of our children, their loved ones, and their teachers can feel cared for, supported, and protected. I will now pass this to Hugh Clements, the director of our COPS office.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Attorney General and Associate Gupta. I know that nothing can take away the pain suffered by the families, the survivors, and the entire Uvalde community. But I do know that the team at the COPS office has been driven to provide an authoritative accounting of everything that transpired at Robb Elementary on May 24th, as well as the events leading up to it and an examination of what happened afterward. As someone with 38 years of law enforcement experience, and 12 of those as chief of the Providence Police Department, I know the importance of having the right policies in place, the right training, and the right partnerships, especially law enforcement partnerships with schools, communities, and other agencies and first responders. This report stresses the importance of those working relationships and how invaluable they are, especially when there's a critical incident. Of course, no one ever thinks something like this is going to happen in their community until it does, which is why the recommendations we provide in this report are so critically important. Unfortunately, the review of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School is not the first critical incident review that the COPS office has conducted. But having done this before, we know the value of the information provided.
Apologies here for the technical issues that we're having. We lost the picture there just momentarily. Now we're trying to restore sound. We're able to get that picture back up. I think we can hear him now.
Place, how incredibly important training is and how critical it is that agencies train together. Reviews such as this can be tremendously helpful and important to both law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve, as they work together to see how they can improve policies, procedures, systems, and most importantly, relationships. We talk about that and much, much more in this report, which I know is going to be a very important resource to law enforcement agencies in the months and the years to come. You will see in this report that the team has worked diligently in carrying out a number of critical steps, including developing a complete incident reconstruction, reviewing thousands of relevant documents, conducting site visits, and interviewing a wide variety of stakeholders. As I said, we know that nothing can take away the pain that this community has endured. But we were dedicated to providing this community with a transparent, independent, and thorough review of what happened. And I believe that this report has done just that. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Attorney General, you just described how were documented profound failures by law enforcement, but the report also makes a point of withholding the names of all but the most senior law enforcement officials. Does this report sufficiently hold accountable the individuals responsible for the failures?
So the report is an analysis of what happened at Uvalde, including by everyone at Uvalde, all responding agencies. It concludes that this was a failure of leadership, and so all members of the leadership who failed were identified. It also identifies individual officers by rank and by what agency they're from, but the standard practice of the Justice Department in these critical incident reviews is not to name those who are not listed as at fault, and particularly not to name those in lower ranks who acted on the scene.
Next question.
Mr. Attorney General.
Case at 12.
I have two questions for you, Mr. Attorney General. Your report here names Pete Arredondo and Mario Vargas as leaders in this incident that happened at Robb Elementary. Had they acted in the way that was put out as guidelines after the Columbine shooting, would lives have been saved on May 24th?
I think the report concludes that had the law enforcement agencies followed generally accepted practices in an active shooter situation and gone right after the shooter to stop him, lives would have been saved and people would have survived.
My second question for you, sir, based on this report, we know at this point no criminal charges have been filed against anyone who responded that day. Based on what you all found in this report, should the Uvalde County District Attorney file any criminal charges for the law enforcement officers who responded that day?
Well, I'm going to leave that question for the DA. Just to explain for everyone, the Justice Department only has criminal jurisdiction where federal crime has occurred. The shooter here is dead, and there's no federal criminal jurisdiction. What we've done is responded to the mayor's request for a critical incident response examination to determine the manner in which the agencies responded and to provide recommendations for the future, and that's what we've done.
Next question. Tribune. Texas Tribune.
Mr. Attorney General, you identified one of the objectives of this analysis to provide law enforcement agencies with recommendations. There are nearly 300.
Could you talk a little louder?
Which recommendations do you think law enforcement agencies should undertake immediately? What's the most urgent issue?
Yeah, so the most significant failure and therefore the most significant and urgent thing for law enforcement to do is active shooter training, which provides that when an active shooter is in a building or anywhere else, the first priority is to stop that shooter and to remove people who are immediately endangered by that shooter. And that requires tactical training. That's the first thing. Say the second thing is critical incident response. Establishing who's going to be the on-site commander, making clear to all other agencies that that person will be the on-site commander. That again requires training and practice and response.
Quick follow-up.
Last. Go ahead. One more and then last.
Should joint training be mandated across the country?
I'm not sure what the word mandated here means. I think it's absolutely necessary that in any circumstance where there's going to be more than one agency responding, and that's going to be in any school situation, all the possible agencies should train together in order to establish lines of communication, command structure, and communications structure in particular. Here radios were not interactive. People did not have a way to talk to each other, and make sure that everybody's following the same strategy.
Last question, Uvalde Leader News.
Mr. Attorney General, some have suggested that our police response was typical for mass shooting, in fact even better in many cases. And they used the Pulse nightclub event as a comparison. It took 3 hours to go in and put down that killer. And there were phone calls back and forth. How do you speak to that?
So actually, I'll let Hugh talk about specifically about the Pulse nightclub, but I will say that what I've described and what the report describes is clearly the generally accepted response to an active shooter. We did a survey across the country, and the experts who were involved in this examination are experts in exactly this subject of active shooter, and there's no doubt that the standard practice is the one I've described. And I'm going to let Hugh answer that specific question.
I would say honestly, I don't know if that's entirely true. I will tell you this report is comprehensive, it's extensive. I urge you all to read it, the executive summary, all hundreds of pages. I will say there was a epic, complete lack of leadership, unity of command. There was no incident command set up. That's not the case with the Pulse nightclub. And so in this particular one, in comparison, that is not entirely true, and the response was a failure of leadership.
Great, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
We had so many more questions. Unfortunately, the question and answer session, though, is ending there in Uvalde. An extraordinary news conference being given, though, by the U.S. Attorney General. We also had the Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta, speaking there, as well as the Director of the Community-Oriented Policing Services, Hugh Clements. Just listening to this, first of all, just so you know, at that community center in Uvalde where all of that just took place, as we understand it, the families of the victims of the Robb Elementary massacre were in that room listening to all of those speakers go over this nearly 600-page report released today by the Department of Justice about all of the, what they call cascading failures in the response to the Robb Elementary shooting almost 2 years ago. As we understand it, those families are getting ready to hold their own news conference just outside that community center, and so we are standing by for that so that we can bring that to you as well. Rebecca Lopez, senior crime and justice reporter here at WFAA, and senior political reporter Jason Whiteley up here as well. You listen to everything that was detailed there, and your heart just hurts for the victims, for the families, for the survivors. We knew so much of what was in this report coming into today. I think the picture that we're getting, though, has been filled in some very tragic ways. I go back to my takeaway from this was no plan for triage.
Right.
Assistant AG Gupta saying that the failure wasn't just the 77 minutes that it took for them to go in and kill the shooter. The failure continued on minute 78 and beyond. You were putting kids who were wounded into buses without being triaged first. You had a child that was put down on the ground outside who ended up dying there. You had kids who had already died being taken by the ambulances meantime to the hospital. Yeah. It is just wrenching, and it has, you think about the families in that room listening to those details.
Yeah, it's complete leadership failure. And for instance, here in Dallas, the fire department will train with the police department. Same in Fort Worth and in the big cities, they train together so that you know the triage, you know who the incident commander is going to be out at the scene. None of that happened.
There was
here.
so much time.
There was just so much time to figure out who's in charge. Let's get the ambulances. Let's get get the triage. Let's see what's going to happen. You have doctors, you have nurses. Parkland, for instance, is one of the triage areas as well of what they're going to do outside the hospital. I mean, there's just so many things that they did not properly train for, and it is really kind of shocking that a school district with its own police department did not train in any of this prior, obviously, to this happening.
And again, we're waiting for those families. We understand there's some movement there, so we may be going to them here in just a few minutes. Jason, you've been pressing about the whole issue of accountability all along, all the way up to the governor. Of course, the DPS director serves at the pleasure of the governor. The DPS director widely criticized in this report, in fact, for instances of misinformation just after this incident had occurred, according to the DOJ. You see again there a live picture just outside that community center where the U.S. Attorney General just got done speaking. It looks like we're just getting set up there. I don't believe that this is a family member. I think they're just checking the microphones, etc. But Jason, on the accountability note, you've been pressing the governor on this. This report is not going to do that. This was just looking at what went wrong.
Sure.
They're leaving the rest to the DA, who has been maligned and criticized here for the fact that we're almost 2 years from this incident and still nothing.
Yeah, the DA in Uvalde County is Christina Mitchell. We still don't know if when her investigation is going to end. Listen, it's easy for us to sit up here on Monday Morning Quarterback this, talk about hindsight being 20/20, but we have other examples since then. We have Allen, Texas.
Yeah.
You had one police officer confront the shooter and take the shooter out. You had the Covenant School in Nashville, Tennessee. One police officer, several went in, one police officer charged that individual and shot and killed that person
The
there.
7-7
Yeah,
shooting
and
here in downtown
7-7
Dallas.
Brent
too.
Thompson, the DART officer, went and shot the shooter, Micah Johnson. He put his life at risk and saved countless of lives.
And all he had
when
was a sidearm.
Ran to he had a sidearm, and he ran towards that gunfire. That is what you do. That is what you're trained to do. And again, part of the training is if you do not have the courage to do that, to protect innocent lives as a law enforcement officer, you should not be a law enforcement officer.
A couple other takeaways that I had here. The Attorney General said the most significant failure of the day, to cap it all off that day, was cops changing their response from an active shooter to a barricaded suspect. As Rebecca has mentioned, they changed the way they respond to that. An active shooter, they're supposed to go in and take the person out. Barricaded suspect, they have a different response to it. Merrick Garland also pointed out, despite 400 police officers being there and failing to act that day, he did say, and we all know this, policing is a noble profession. It's also a hard one. Vanita Gupta, the assistant there, also saying too, we take law enforcement for granted. That we do on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's clear they're not trying to pile on here.
Right.
What they're
They're
saying
not.
is, and you heard Vanita Gupta saying this, this is really hard to look at. This is really hard to keep going through. It's hard to look at the truth, she said, but then she said, we cannot look away. Let's listen into the families in Uvalde now.
Yeah, I can do that. KOSKOFF. And I'm one of the attorneys who is honored, maybe the wrong word, but who is representing with the gravest of concerns these families, along with my wonderful co-counsel, Aaron Rogiers. Aaron, spell your name.
Rogiers.
And so Aaron and I, we've been asked by 17 families, 16 of whom have lost children, to investigate and evaluate potential legal action. And in a moment, we'll turn to the families and they'll tell you what their response is to what they've learned and what they're still learning. Understand that the report has not been made available but for about an hour or two, and it is voluminous, as you've heard. So most of our reaction is really based on what we heard from the Attorney General and his team last night. And so I want to talk about three things. The first thing I want to say is that the families appreciate the Attorney General's commitment to seeing this investigation through. For families in this situation, transparency and comfort and knowing that your government or your state is listening to you and are concerned about what you and your families went through is critically important. They haven't gotten a lot of that from the state of Texas, so for them, that is very much appreciated. And it was clear not just that the DOJ has taken this investigation very seriously, but that the Attorney General himself, I think you saw it, has expressed great empathy, and that's also very appreciated by the families. There are limitations, though. These families didn't need a 400 or 500-page government report to learn that law enforcement failed them in a historic way. They didn't need the report to tell them that law enforcement violated its most sacred responsibility, and that is to protect our children in a time of great need. They didn't need that. Why didn't they need that? Because they were there. Some had AR-15s pointed at them as they desperately tried to help when law enforcement wouldn't. They were there as their children were being killed while law enforcement was paralyzed. They were there. So they did not need to learn that. But the details of the investigation will come out for whatever value they provide. It's important to understand go back and let's just refresh our recollection about what happened that day. Within minutes, really, hundreds of heavily armed law enforcement officers were there from all different agencies. The DEA was there. The Border Patrol was there. The Uvalde police were there. The school police were there. The county police were there. Texas Marshals were there. It was a convergence of heavily armed and mostly very well-trained law enforcement agents. And you would think that they were fighting to protect a major army from invading us at our borders, as we would like our law enforcement to protect us. But who was on the other side of this epic battle? What were they afraid of? Were they afraid of an 18-year-old kid? This 18-year-old, let's remember, was about 5'5" or 5'6". He was 140 pounds, soaking wet. Were they really afraid of this kid? No. They were afraid of his weapon. And it turns out that even some of these well-trained officers are human beings. And guess what? We've learned from this event, from Parkland and other events where law enforcement got cold feet. These people were scared. They were scared because they're human beings, and they were scared of getting killed. And they waited around while somebody else was going to be brave enough to intervene. The questions that are not answered in this report are significantly more important than the questions that are. This 18-year-old kid was able to walk into a store down the street and acquire a military weapon, a Daniel Defense AR-15. And within about a week, he acquired another one. The day he turned 18, he had made his decision long in advance. In fact, he had ordered 60 30-round magazines, and they were delivered to his home. How did that happen? Where's the government investigation on how this kid got this firepower? The other thing that happened is he ordered over 1,700 rounds of ammunition from an online ammo dealer. How could that happen? How could that happen? Where's the investigation into that? How did this 18-year-old kid even know enough to know how to equip himself in this way? What happened? What are the means by which gun companies are marketing these weapons to our children? How are they reaching them? Where's the role of marketing and the gun companies in this report? There's no fault or investigation whatsoever. The truth is you can respond to an active shooting, but let's not delude ourselves. You might be able to save a few lives, but we can't accept that that's the best we can do. Over 12 years ago, or about 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago, after the Sandy Hook shooting, shattered families went to the United States Senate and they begged, they pleaded, they said to our elected officials, it's too late for us. Our children were just killed by a kid, a troubled kid under 21 who used an AR-15 to kill our children. They said, help us. You can't help us, but you can help us by helping others. You can help us by help. And Congress turned their back on the Sandy Hook families. And Congress turned their back on the Sandy Hook families. And because of that, and by the way, the Sandy Hook families weren't the only families to plead, to beg, to say, let's protect our children. There were other families. Every mass shooting that occurs, almost, there are families pleading with the government to do something. Parkland families said the same thing. They said, okay, how about now? How about now? Let's limit the access to these weapons to children, to kids 18, 19, 20 years old. And Congress thumbed their nose at the Parkland families. And Merrick, the Attorney General, is here. He's done nobody can fault the Attorney General for his commitment to this or his concern for these families. It's very moving, and his entire office, and I applaud them in this effort. But the Attorney General wouldn't be here. None of his team would be here. I wouldn't be standing here. Most importantly, these wonderful families wouldn't be here, standing here, pleading, talking about what happened that day. You wouldn't be here. But if Congress had just listened, if the Senate just listened to the Sandy Hook families, if they had just listened to Parkland, you know who would be here? Eva Morelos, Irma Garcia, Uzziah Garcia, Xavier Lopez, Amory Joe Garza, Jose Flores Jr., Aletha Ramirez, Annabel Guadalupe Rodriguez, Eliana Torres, Eliana Garcia, Rogelio Torres, Jacqueline Casares, Jayla Silvera, Jace Luevanos, Lexi Rubio, Tess Mata, McKenna Elrod, Neve Bravo, Layla Salazar, Maite Rodriguez, and Miranda Mathis. Think about that. This shooting doesn't happen if our government had just listened to these families, or and not just our government, but if the state of Texas had just even done the paltry thing of making it, even raising the age to 21, they would all be alive. And isn't that such a small price to pay? Yeah. We're going to turn it over now. Sorry? Yeah. We're going to turn it over now to our wonderful families who would like to speak and express themselves. And I'll introduce Kimberly Rubio.
Folks, a few families will speak, and then we'll do questions at the end, okay?
Reading this report this morning, I read that Pete directed officers intending to gain entry into the classroom to stop, that no leader effectively questioned the decision and lack of urgency of UCISD PD Chief Arredondo and UPD Acting Chief Mariano Pargas toward entering classrooms 111 and 112, and that leadership can arise regardless of rank and title. I hope that the failures end today and that local officials do what wasn't done that day, do right by the victims and survivors of Robb Elementary, terminations, criminal prosecutions. And our state and federal government enact sensible gun laws, because Robb Elementary began the day an 18-year-old was allowed to purchase an AR-15.
Most importantly, from what we've seen with this report, and I commend the DOJ on doing this, is that although there isn't every name of the officers that were there so that we can hold them accountable, because we have to do our own digging most of the time, there are names that are named. And it is time, because our community is so divided because of this, because they don't want to believe that the people that they grew up with failed our children and they stand against us. I'm hoping that they read this and they see Johnny Field's name, or Mariano Pargas's, who is a county commissioner right now, or Constable Zamora, who is running for re-election. There are names in there, and the community needs to see this, and y'all need, because the DOJ stamp is on there, maybe y'all will start taking us seriously now, instead of telling us to move on, telling us to sweep it under the rug, and not doing a damn thing about it. We need our community. It's hard enough waking up every day and continuing to walk out on these streets and walk to an HEB or drive to an HEB and see a cop that you know was standing there while our babies were murdered and bleeding out. It's hard enough that. But this community doesn't care, and I hope this makes y'all. I also hope that this lights a fire up under the district attorney's ass, because we know that she has not done a damn thing, and we refuse to accept that. Do your job.
Let's try to go one at a time and just introduce yourselves so they know who they're talking to. Where do we want to start? Shimon, go ahead.
Yeah, so just
let them know who you are, Shimon.
Shimon Prokopez, CNN. Just, do you guys feel that the report went far enough in naming people and holding people accountability? Because, as we know, the DPS had the largest number of law enforcement officials outside of the CBP. And there's a lot of video and a lot of information about their actions that day. But it doesn't seem that this report really touches on their actions, and it seems to focus mostly on the local officers and the Redondo chiefs. Are you concerned about that? Just maybe some reaction to that.
I don't see why. I don't understand why they are allowed privacy. My child, their children, they are named in this report because they are dead. Everybody should have been named.
Do you feel, Kim, if I can follow up, that somehow maybe DPS is off the hook on this, but when you look at this report, do any of you want to just...
I mean, it's kind of hard to answer the question because we've only been given an hour and a half to kind of just look through the report. So we don't even know if they are mentioned in there or not. We would hope that they are because they were there. So we hope that they would be accountable for their actions as well.
Johnny, following up on that, Monica Madden, KXAN and Nexstar. I know that you said you're still sifting through the report and everything, but were you hoping that the Attorney General would have addressed a lot of more of the aftermath, the delays in the DA's investigation, DPS's investigation into its office's actions and accountability? Were you hoping that he would address more of that publicly?
I mean, of course we would have. We're grateful that we got what we have right now because it's probably the most updated information that any of us have gotten since May 24th. So we're very appreciative of what he's done right now. But yeah, we would have liked to have more information about it.
With Jim Ryan with ABC Radio, did you learn anything new from what you've seen in this report? Is there anything that you didn't know before?
We knew as families, you know, just kind of talking amongst each other, we knew the failures that had happened. We just kind of, it makes more clarity now because it's written and now it's set in stone, and what we thought is true. So
I did learn something.
You did?
I didn't realize that the scene was compromised.
What? I'm sorry.
The scene was compromised, that there was people that shouldn't have been there that were entering the classroom. That's mentioned in the report.
And how did that make you feel to learn that?
I want to continue reading more when we're done here.
So a couple more and then we can go read.
Two quick ones. News 4, WAI, KBB in San Antonio. In all of your guys' mind, is there any question left that the DA should have all that she needs, all that she is required to have for her investigation to be able to pursue criminal charges now at this point?
Yeah, what else does she need? Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most extensive piece that we have about all of the failures that happened that day. What else does she possibly need to prosecute or to remove these people from their positions of power when they can't even do their jobs?
Yami Virgin, KBB WOAI. How safe are the children of Uvalde right now?
I think the point of this is that none of us are safe. That's what, Josh just mentioned. None of us are safe because these weapons are on the streets.
Can I just get a, sorry.
Hi, Amanda Underside, News Boards on San Antonio. I've talked to so many of you over the past year. A lot of you recently have expressed concerns about the 2-year mark, meaning that the statute of limitations for misdemeanors will expire. Are you hoping that this will potentially fast track the upcoming DA investigation, the ongoing DA investigation?
Well, the DA, even the DA can't get in our way of fully in our way of an investigation. But it ought to be, to your point, it ought to be said that the DA, with the help of the AG here in Texas, is fighting the disclosure of a lot of this important information. So the DA is effectively, the DA has a job to do. We understand that, but she's locked up this information that these families deserve to have access to evaluate their legal rights. There's no reason why she can't do her job so that we can do ours, and so that these families get the information they deserve to make the decisions they have to make.
Assuming she's still giving you no timeline updates?
I mean, I think at this point, it's not a good bet to bet on the DA's timelines.
Okay. Sergio Martinez,
Yes, sir.
Texas Newsroom. Quick question. You talk about how you're representing the family. You're trying to conduct an investigation. What's the purpose of it? Is it potentially to sue the local law enforcement agencies? Like, what are you hoping?
Well, it's similar. Of course, the DOJ looks at the criminal, and the DA is looking at criminal allegations. But the other facet to these incidents is what went wrong, and how can we hold those people accountable in the traditional other means that we do so, which is by bringing legal action against them, so that there's another incentive to clean up their act, right? And so we have to look at all the angles here. What contributed to this? And it should be noted that when many of us were growing up, maybe am I the oldest person here? But when many of us were growing up, we didn't have these routine mass shootings with AR-15s. But guess what? AR-15s were available. So something's changed. And so one of the big things that we've seen in Sandy Hook and Parkland and other cases is that what's changed is the way these weapons are pushed on youth. And this is a tragic and unnecessary example of the repercussions of that. When I was growing up, nobody knew what an AR-15 was, and here every kid of a certain age, especially boys, know what they are because they're being courted, and they're being courted with other actors like social media and et cetera. So these gun companies are really pushing these products on kids for these types of missions.
Can we get reaction from the Texas Tribune? Are you suggesting that you're going to pursue charges against gun manufacturers?
Well, I don't bring charges, but fair enough. But the legal issues that we're under consideration now, I can't really speak about beyond just the big picture type of things that you have to look at an incident like this. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into something like this.
For the families now, what are the next steps? As we now have one of these investigations out, there's numerous. The DPS is still doing their investigation. We obviously have the DA who is still doing theirs. What is next for all of you as you continue to try and move forward and, one, put the day behind you, but two, create change?
I think we're going to continue fighting. We're going to continue fighting that some type of change is made in honor of our kids. We have nothing left but to fight for them. We are their voices now, so we're going to continue.
Can I just get a reaction from someone, the Attorney General, having him stand there, a very significant moment when he says that had officers followed protocol and procedure, lives could have potentially been saved. How was that? How was that for you to hear him say that?
I mean, how do you want us to react to that?
Because so many people have not wanted to say that here, from the law enforcement officials.
It was pretty hard. Respectful for telling us, but it was pretty hard, to hear that. When he sits there and says that, lives could have been saved. I just get a little closer to the mic. Like, I just couldn't believe it. For these officers to sit there and just not do anything, and still be out here, you know, on the streets like nothing happened, you know. And my daughter's gone. It's hard.
You can feel just a fraction of the pain of those parents in Uvalde. We do want you to know that the parents asked for this forum. We didn't, as the media, camp out and wait for them to come out and start bombarding them with questions. They wanted to be able to speak, to let their feelings be known after they got this report this morning, just like all the rest of us did. Many of them, as you heard there, have been poring over it for the past couple of hours and say that they want to get back to reading it once that news conference was over there. The 600-page or so report coming from the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice this morning, laying out what they call a cascade of failures in the response to the Uvalde shooting at Robb Elementary, May 24th of 2022, that left 19 elementary school students dead and 2 elementary teachers dead. We're going to wrap up with just a few takeaways here, and then we will continue our digital coverage. Rebecca, what do you close out with here? What struck you the most?
Well, I think that these families continuing to demand criminal charges, and that the DA is moving very slowly on this and has had plenty of time to digest all of the evidence. I mean, we've had 2 major reports now come out, and the mom who said, "Our children are named in this report because they are dead. Everyone should be named in this report." Of course, Merrick Garland, Attorney General, saying that they don't name the lower level officers in these types of reports, only the commanders that should have been in charge but weren't in charge, really. But they wanted names. They wanted accountability for every officer who stood there and did nothing. Now, I want to preface this by saying that there are a lot of courageous officers every day that put their lives on the line, that protect the public. The majority of officers in this country are heroes, and they do save lives. In this case, these officers did not act like the majority of officers do every day.
And the Attorney General's office went to pains today to say the same thing in that news conference. Jason, it sounds like we're seeing that spotlight get more and more focused on that district attorney there in Uvalde. Even the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General, saying today, we don't have jurisdiction here. This is an after-incident report to show all the things that went wrong, but we can't bring charges. That's up to the DA, who still hasn't moved on this.
And the DA is Christina Mitchell there in Uvalde County. She has not moved on this. It's been almost 2 years now. Come May, it will be 2 years, and we have not seen whether she is going to prosecute anyone. So far, no one has been held accountable, and that's one of the issues that frustrates and angers so many of the folks in Uvalde, understandably so. The bottom line takeaway for this today, this Department of Justice report, is this is an analysis. It is not accountability. And we heard from one of the women you heard just a moment ago. She said, no leader there on scene that day in May of 2022 actually questioned the school police chief, Pete Arredondo, and leadership can arise, she pointed out, from any rank or any title. 400 police officers on scene there that day. No one took command and control. One of the things they pointed out, there was not an incident command established. And that's what happens at any big situation. There's always one place where the leader goes to. Rebecca can expand on this. And that did not happen there. That's why things were going in different directions. The woman also pointing out, too, she said that she wants terminations, she wants criminal prosecutions, and she wants sensible gun laws. It is worth noting the Texas legislature refused to even consider raising the age limit to purchase a rifle from 18 to 22. The Republicans in charge shot that down. Several Republicans who supported that in committee are now being challenged simply because they supported that, Jason.
All right, we still have a lot to get into with this. We're left with the quote from that one mother saying, "I hope the failures end today." We're going to get into a lot more coverage digitally at WFAA.com if you want to stay with us there. For now, though, we're going to wrap up things here on the air and return you back to ABC programming. Again, our coverage continues, though, right now, WFAA.com. All right, welcome back, thanks for staying with us. We have now come off of broadcast, and we're going to continue our coverage of the extraordinary events in Uvalde this morning, Uvalde, Texas, where we've gotten this enormous report from the Department of Justice on all of the failures that happened there. senior political reporter Jason Whiteley stepping away.
I'm going to swap out because we have an expert over here who's fantastic.
So we're trading one expert for another here.
Here we go.
We still have senior crime and justice reporter Rebecca Lopez here, and now we are bringing in a brain trust to kind of help us run through this. Craig Miller, former DISD chief and deputy chief at Dallas Police, and who now consults with schools about active shooters. Unfortunately, that is a job title. That is a role, a very vital one these days. And we just heard from the Attorney General there, the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland, saying, you know, they laid out this enormous report on all of the failures that happened in the response to the active shooter in Uvalde, because they're looking ahead. They know that another one's going to happen, and they're trying to lay out best practices. And sometimes the way you get to best practices is to look at worst practices, and we saw so many failures.
You know, and
in Uvalde.
it's easy to point to the Uvalde ISD, the 6 officers that made up that department, but there were, like they said, FBI agents that went out there, Border Patrol agents, that are highly trained. You had Texas Rangers, DPS out there. You had a majority. You had people coming in from all different jurisdictions. I don't remember how many. I forget now how many police departments and federal agencies were out there, and not a one of them did anything. And I guess that's one of the questions that I have for Craig. So Craig, when you listen to this report, I know that you were very frustrated when you saw what happened.
Yes.
What do you make of what they're saying here today?
Well, I think they're finally trying to hold people accountable for what they should have done out there. Now, there's been other reports DPS has done that you know, talk about this as well. I think that this is an independent group who's brought together. You know, one of the things for me that I'm let's just go back to the people who the International Association of Chiefs of Police put on the committee to be involved in this. I think it was seven police commanders from different places. I think the individual that was talking there was from Rhode Island, I believe. It was. I would like to have seen someone with school law enforcement have been on that committee. It's if you've never worked with a principal, if you've never worked with school administration, it is easy to second guess how law enforcement is perceived by school educators, because it's maybe not what we all think that it is. Sometimes law enforcement on a school campus really is a square peg in a round hole. They need us to be at that school. They don't necessarily always want us to be at that school. I think, you know, one of the things that's most important that comes out of this report is the critical incident, the incident command system structure failure that we had here, the catastrophic failure that we had with Pete Arredondo being in charge, or was he in charge, or who was in charge? Because I think people misunderstand this. And I'm at the top of the list, along with everyone else in law enforcement that recognizes this as a failure. But it's important, I think, for people to understand that law enforcement is a paramilitary organization, and we have a structure. And there were large hulking officers included in these 376 people that were outside there that could have barehanded taken the hinges off the door. But the
unlocked door.
Yes, sir.
That they were waiting to find the keys for. Just to your point there real quickly, you know, we see in this report from the Department of Justice this morning that the sheriff there on the scene, as well as the acting chief of the police department, it says they were standing within 10 to 15 feet of each other outside the exterior door. However, they were not coordinating with one another and continued to act independently. That's just stunning, considering how many mass shootings we have had, and school shootings more specifically, leading up to the one in Uvalde, that there could be that kind of dysfunction in the response to it. And then the thing we were talking about earlier, where in that 77 minutes of dysfunction and waiting to go in, no one was even setting up over here to talk about triage when we finally get in there to take care of these kids and these teachers.
Yeah, and that's really obviously unacceptable. You know, we're I think 23 agencies, law enforcement agencies, responded on that day, and not everyone was actively involved in what was going on inside the school. So there was ample opportunity for people to assist first paramedics in setting a triage area up and being ready. And I understand that, you know, you don't want to rush triage people into the situation where they could be shot, because if they're not helpful to somebody, it doesn't do anybody any good.
Right.
But to have set that up outside is different. But I think something that you hit on there is really important, and that is you perform how you practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that's come out of this through HB3, where we've started, we're just, in my mind, just starting to do some things that need to take place, where now counties of a population of less than 350,000 are required to meet with the school. Okay. Mm-hmm. In my mind, I don't know why we're limiting that to counties of less, because of the 264 counties in Texas, I don't know how many actually have less than 350,000 population. I doubt very many.
Yeah. You gotta get way out. Yeah.
So the thing is that, you know, if you look at large metropolitan areas, and I'll Dallas Independent School District is in 5 different cities. You know, Mesquite, Balch Springs, Hutchins. You know, Dallas. Mm-hmm. Do those cities all coordinate and communicate and practice exercises?
Because what's the point if you don't?
Yeah, and how can they talk? You know, I think radio interoperability is going to be one of the things that I'm really interested to hear what they say in this, because if you've got 23 agencies outside talking, and we know that we've got children who are calling 911 and saying, I'm injured, I'm in the classroom, there were officers outside that had no idea that those conversations were taking place. And had they known that, they would have, I believe, performed differently.
Could any officer, I mean, they might have faced discipline, simply just taken it into their own hands and gone in and shot the shooter and gone. I mean, any one of those officers standing out there could have done that with or without an incident commander.
Even if they were directed to stop, could
they?
Yeah, no, absolutely they could have. It's just, once again, getting back to how we're raised in law enforcement. If the chief says this is what we're doing, I'm just passing the word down, this is what the chief said we're going to do. Yes, in hindsight, absolutely, that should have taken place. But you had state officers that were there as well, you know, the Department of Public Safety officers that were there. You know, there were this is not in a vacuum. There are a lot of people that play a role in what took place in this. But it's obvious there's a catastrophic failure on law enforcement's part. We know that, and it's obvious that these people want more answers. If any one of us had ever lost a child in a shooting similar to this, we would all want answers. We would be demanding answers the same as they are. What we have to really focus on is that, you know, moving forward, how do we do better? How do we learn from this experience? You know, we Santa Fe was in Texas. You know, what did we do? We did Senate Bill 11. Okay, now we've done HB3. And what is HB3? How far does HB3 go? Mm-hmm. You know, and so there's a lot of different things we could talk about with regards to HB3. And what they have. You know, this has forced the governor to give a stronger role to the Texas Education Association, TEA, and working in conjunction with the Texas School Safety Center. But this still gets back to, in a crisis across the state of Texas, does the chief of police of the city know the phone number to the superintendent?
Mm-hmm, yeah, or have a radio that speaks to the the officers there at the school district. We want to play a little bit of sound for you now from State Senator Roland Gutierrez. He of course represents Uvalde and has been very passionate about this and had a lot to say about it in the lead up to today. Here's what he had to say after what we've learned this morning.
Those cops were cowards, and those kids were braver than the cops. At about the 20-minute mark, there was a call from Chloe Torres. Chloe said, we're in here. Come get us. And no help came. Thank God Chloe made it. Some of her friends didn't make it. And here's the sad part about all of this. What would have happened if they'd have done their job? They didn't kill these kids, I get that. What would have happened if they'd have gone in at minute 12? How many kids would be alive today? They all need to explain themselves to us. There was a memo that was exposed by one of the agencies in one of the news stories, an internal memo with DPS, where Steve McCraw says, relax. No one's going to get fired over this. There's been no accountability at this agency. One man they said was fired was allowed to retire. And the other Texas Ranger, they said they fired is still on the payroll, $100,000 later sitting on his couch. Steve McCraw will tell me, well, that's because the DA's investigation isn't done yet. You all heard in that leaked story several months ago where more than one, more than two, and more than 5 cops uttered about that gun. These cops were afraid of that gun. They don't have the decency and the fortitude to go into that building in Dawson or into the halls of Washington as law enforcement and say, do something about this gun, because it's a killer. It's a killer of kids. It's a killer of human beings. It's a war rifle and nothing more. I have a whole lot of guns, and I fired that one. Most powerful gun I've ever fired. We need to do something about this for sure.
Or just Craig.
Again, some passionate words coming today from State Senator Roland Gutierrez, who represents the Uvalde area. I want to bring Craig Miller back in to discuss this more. Former DISD police chief and deputy chief at Dallas Police Department, who now does consulting for schools, relating to active shooter situations and security. We listen to this. As we said earlier, this isn't a day to pile on to law enforcement. We even heard the Associate AG this morning, Vanita Gupta, saying, we take law enforcement for granted in this country. They go running into dangerous situations every day. They didn't go running into this one, though, and we have to learn from these sorts of things. Do you think that there will be a legacy that comes from Uvalde? Is there already a legacy that comes from Uvalde, notwithstanding any legislation, but police officers out there, will they pick up from this and go, you know what, if I ever encounter something like this, I don't care if somebody's telling me to back up and wait. If I see this going on where I am, I'm going in.
Well, I absolutely do. I believe that some of the changes that have come place after this with regards to the active shooter training that wasn't necessarily mandated, that is now mandated for police officers. It's really important. There are just over 1,000 public school districts in the state of Texas, not counting charter schools, 1,023. About 300 of them have their own school district police departments. That means the other 700 are using the local municipal police officers or sheriff's department to come into their schools. And how those guys are trained. In our area, for example, Richardson ISD has Dallas PD officers in it because the schools are in the city of Dallas. It's important that the officers that are in those schools are trained and get the active shooter training and know what to do, understand the incident command system. Everybody in law enforcement at every level should understand the incident command system, kind of the pecking order for who's in charge at a situation. We want to follow our directives. We have supervisors. We have to keep a chain of command. We can't have just people, not being in compliance with what we have an expectation of. But I absolutely believe that we will remember this incident just as we do Sandy Hook, just as we do Parkland, as we do Santa Fe, and now this shooting. But this is without question. When you look at Parkland, you have one officer that fails to immediately go in. Here you have 376 officers that are there from 23 different agencies that all had an opportunity to take action.
Craig, the families really want accountability. They want somebody criminally charged. What are the chances? What could they even charge these officers with if they charged them with anything in this situation?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but the first thing that I think I would look at would be the criminal charge failure to render aid. It's generally associated with traffic accidents. Someone's injured in a traffic accident, but I know in the civil process, which I'm more so involved with these days, and much more so than the criminal part of it, that failure to render aid, just like at a police officer shooting, do the officers who just shot an individual have an expectation that they're supposed to try and extend that person's life and save their life, even though they just moments before pointed a gun at them? And so here we have a situation where perhaps the triage and who was accountable, does this report identify who is the person, who was the county official for the firefighters that was there, the emergency ambulance service. I don't know if they were from the city or they were a third-party group that was responsible for that. Who were they talking to? Were they asking to be included? There's a lot of questions I think you have to ask that way. But I don't, you know, there's a reason a lot of information doesn't get released, because there could possibly be a trial, and you don't want to compromise jurors, you know, for information that they could hear that might be critical if we do get to that point where we want to levy criminal charges.
And isn't part of the civil, part of the civil trial, if you're suing them civilly, is how would a reasonable officer would have acted in this situation? Wouldn't that come up in any of these trials?
Well, that's a critical for the civil part of this. What is the, you know, the Supreme Court has said, you know, what would an objectively reasonable police officer faced with the same or similar set of circumstances have done with that information that they had? And you know, that's why I think it's very important for the lawyer in this case. He's wanting this release of this information, because we're coming up on the 2-year statute of limitations in May,
right.
And you know, they want to have as much information as they can, because they want to get a financial reward for the families who lost a child.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and the state's been fighting that and
yes.
dragging that out, and because of that, they may run into that wall of the statute of limitations, which is another story in itself.
Yes.
You do wonder here, and that attorney you were hearing from representing 17 families, 16 of whom lost children there at Robb Elementary. His name is Josh Koskoff, who is well known in situations like this. He actually obtained the $73 million settlement for the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting victims years ago. One issue of liability that just came up today, I hadn't heard this one before, when the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General, was having that news conference about this big report from the DOJ saying that some of these officers had never gotten any active shooter training, which that's mandated. I mean, it
is, and that's, you know,
that sounds like some districts or some departments might have some liability there.
A big part of the civil lawsuits are something called Monell standards, and Monell standards have to do with failure to train and failure to supervise. And I think that has nothing to do with the district attorney. She could actually care less about that. She's focused on the criminal aspect of this. But for Mr. Koskoff, he is very intrigued and interested in seeing the standard operating procedures, the general orders for each of those agencies, and how did they train, and what if they didn't train, and if it's in fact true. But that gets back into what we said just a minute ago: you perform how you practice. And if you as a collectively as a group, if the people in that region, that area, aren't coming together to practice with one another, to understand, well, if I can hear you on the radio, how do we communicate? And if that's the case, and we know ahead of time, why aren't we trying to figure out how we can get on the same radio frequency? Yeah. You know, I would be willing to bet you that in our area where we are immediately, the Dallas ISD Police Department does not have radio communication with the 5 cities that their school's located in.
Yeah.
Wow. Real quickly here, we want to remind everyone that we are efforting a reaction from the governor, Governor Abbott, today. As we understand it right now, he is hosting the Baseball World Series champion Texas Rangers and celebrating them today. And we are at that event trying to get a reaction from him to this Department of Justice report, because, you know, keep in mind here, Jason Whiteley, who was with us earlier, has asked the governor on multiple occasions, hey, what's going to happen with Steve McCraw, the director of the Department of Public Safety, who was in charge of DPS there at the scene? Now, that is his department. We had a lot of troopers there who also were just standing and staging in that hallway. When will we see potential accountability there? And all along the governor has said, well, let's wait for the information, let's wait for the reports. Well, this is an extraordinary report that's been laid out here that said there was a failure of leadership at all levels. They didn't spare anyone who was in leadership. And so now the question is there accountability? Will we see something happen with Steve McCraw, the director of DPS? As we're waiting for that, we have gotten a statement from President Biden about this report today from his Justice Department. I want to read that to you here. It says, today's report makes clear several things: that there was a failure to establish a clear command and control structure, that law enforcement should have quickly deemed this incident an active shooter situation and responded accordingly, and that clearer and more detailed plans in the school district were required to prepare for the possibility that this could could occur. Again, we're looking at those plans, and obviously there were big holes in those plans, as has been laid out in this report. And one of the things that we talked about before you got here, Craig, was these stimulus events, as they call them. This report lays out that from the time that law enforcement entered Robb Elementary, they say there was a span of more than an hour in there when there were at least 10 stimulus events, including at least 6 separate instances of gunfire, totaling approximately 45 rounds in law enforcement officer presence. Yeah. So they knew that this, in other words, what they're laying out there is that time after time after time after time there, while they were in the hallway, they knew that this was not just a barricaded subject, that there was still active shooting. Taking place inside there. And the report concludes any one of these events should have driven the law enforcement response to take steps to immediately stop the killing per active shooter protocols. How do you incorporate this into your consulting work? I mean, do you pull bits and pieces from this as well and go, look at this, memorize this, know this?
Well, I work with, if you look at HB3, Texas is broken down into educational service centers. And we here in Dallas are in the ESC Region 10, Fort Worth is ESC Region 11. Last year I did 7 safety summits one-day summits with districts where I brought in speakers to talk about the things that what we're discussing here now, and who are you doing the things that you need to do. And I think that's one of the things that's most shocking is the fact that the who was in charge or not in charge, and then the officers just not taking their action and doing the training they should have done. Columbine was 1999, and following Columbine, we've got 20 years in between Columbine and this shooting where, the mantra is we go to the gunfire. That's what we do.
It's happened time and again.
Yeah, they didn't even have to really wait for orders from anyone. If there's an active shooter, you're just trained to stop the threat immediately. That's your number one priority.
It is.
Whether it's a risk to your own life.
It is, and I just believe when I watch the videos and the communications that I've learned took place, that this issue about who was in charge was really the officers. If they're down the pecking order, they're waiting for those instructions. I'm ready to go, but they never got the instructions to do that. They certainly had the ability to override that, and in hindsight, 2020, yeah, we should have done that, but that just didn't take place. And it's difficult brought up in a paramilitary organization to tell the person who's above you, and especially at that chief's level, even if he's a chief of a 6-man department, he's still a chief.
Yeah, it's hard
to
go against that.
But even prior to them setting up an incident command center, when there's gunfire and there's an active shooter in the school, there is no leadership commander at that point. It is you, the patrol officer, with your weapon, and you can go in with that weapon even if that's all you have. So I think that's what the report said.
It's almost like you've got competing mandates there. It is hard to go against that grain and to go against somebody above you, especially if they're telling you, hey, stop, let's not go running in. But then you also have this active shooting training that has been drilled into your mind that you get in there and you take it down. So it's almost like you have competing narratives going on in your own mind as you're responding and trying to make those decisions on the fly.
And that gets back to what you perform, how you practice. And that, in hindsight, what Mr. Koskoff will be looking at, when was the last time a tabletop exercise was conducted with these entities who responded to this call? When was the last time an active, full-scale operation, my guess is never, was held, where people from the fire department, from the police department, from federal agencies, from other local agencies all responded to a simulated exercise? It didn't take place.
I wonder if you do one of those exercises now going forward where you make things go wrong. You make a chief start to give an order that is incorrect, that goes against the training. Does the person still go in? Is that a lesson that's learned from this to augment that training to have to make that decision on the fly?
Real quickly, one of the things that I also saw in this report, I know we're trying to wrap up here, but one of the things that is really disturbing, Craig, is that after all of this, and after the shooting, days afterwards, the officers were going into the crime scene to look at the crime scene and gawk. How appalled are you by the actions of the officers even after the shooting?
Well, that's contamination. You know, I know from my experience in Dallas PD, if you were at a scene of a homicide and someone, you weren't able to touch the body, that could only be performed by someone from the medical examiner's office. And so I guess to contaminate the scene, a crime scene like this was, even though the suspect was deceased, you know, we know we've got a lot of questions that are going to be asked, and it's going to be a lot of investigations that take place. This isn't like TV. This is going to go on for days. And, you know, it is appalling, I think, that they violated that standard of going in and contaminating a crime scene for any purpose, much less to gawk or to take video that might be used or given to someone else.
Craig Miller, invaluable experience and expertise being brought here, former DISD chief and deputy chief of DPD, who now consults with schools on how to make them safer and deal with, God forbid, you know, an active shooter situation if it comes to their school. Thanks for being with us and sharing the insight today.
Thank you.
And we want to thank you for being with us here online and on the air on this extraordinary day when we have gotten this enormous report, this nearly 600-page report from the Department of Justice laying out that cascade of failures at the response at Robb Elementary in that mass shooting in May of 2022. We are still making our way through that report. It is voluminous. We're going to have a lot more coverage as we continue through the day. We've heard from families, we've heard from attorneys, we've heard from the Attorney General of the United States. We're putting all of this together, so be sure to join us later on today at 4, 5, 6, and 10 for more coverage on this. For now, though, again, thanks for being with us today. Really appreciate it.